I want to talk a bit today, Sir Graham, about the impact on Hackney and what the government needs to do. And I shall have some warn the Minister, shall have some very direct requests for her to answer, hopefully today. In Hackney, from November 2017 to today, there have been 7 gang-related murders in Hackney and 3 other murders. And I choose that date because prior to that, there had been a 2-year period when there hadn't been a gang-related death. But since October last year, there have been 8 stabbings, including the most recent of a 50-year-old man on the streets of Hackney last night. And this is, as other colleagues have said, we can quote the statistics as much as we want, but this is all about real human lives. And I think too many of us have had to visit families whose lives have been devastated, families who will never have lived the same life again because of the loss of a child, not just their child, but an actual child in their household. And I'm choosing today not to name my constituents who have to live through enough of the pain as it is, and I'm aware that there may be media scrutiny of what we say today. But I want to quote from one constituent who I spoke to just recently, whose son was stabbed 8 times in an ambush in Hackney on the 7th of November last year. She said, when he started to speak to me, this is after she was visiting him in hospital, I felt physically sick and wanted to vomit. I told him I was feeling sick, and he said, "It's okay, I've been sick so many times since arriving here, just sit down." He told me what had happened. He was ambushed, and knives were coming at him from all angles. I thought that was it, he said. I didn't even know these guys. They just ambushed me and started stabbing me. My son underwent surgery to his legs, chest, arms, and his 2 hands will need plastic surgery. But she said, I'm blessed that I am a mother who can say, thank God my son is alive. Because despite that horror, Sir Graham, that young man is alive today, but after such a horrific event with life-changing injuries. And then she went on to say that I have serious concerns and really don't know where to turn for the support and advice. And on that, I address the Minister here. She speaks for so many, whether it's youth workers, teachers, families themselves, friends of those young people. Where do you turn, as my honourable friend, the member for West Ham said, where do you turn to tell someone about what's going on? After we had the riots in Hackney, which is a slightly separate issue to what we're discussing today, there was a very good number of community events where people talked about what had happened in those circumstances. I don't want to go too much down that route. But what was very apparent is people in communities know which are the vulnerable children in their midst. They know, but are not sure where to take that information and who can help. And are sometimes fearful of the intervention of authorities who can come in and do things to people. We all know of case conferences where a vulnerable young person has 8 or 10 adults in the room all talking about them, but not necessarily talking with them. But in Hackney, we live the problem, sadly, all too often. But Hackney has a gangs integration unit which works on a regular basis with 150 gang nominals at any one time. But a number of the factors that are now affecting Hackney are affecting, I know, other boroughs, where the gang youngers are being connected to, often getting involved, sometimes because the older perpetrators are in prison. They step in, and it really underlines that early intervention that so many colleagues have talked about. So many young children, aged 9 and 10 even, are getting involved now. We need to get that early intervention in place, and I will be asking the Minister about that later. And the county lines grooming has been working. There's a danger, I think, that we conflate knife crime with county lines with gangs. It's not necessarily all related, but it's like a Venn diagram. There is obviously an overlap. And I think just to illustrate the effect, Sir Graham, on very young people in my constituency, I spoke to a youth worker who told me about a young boy of around 10 who'd been given a gun to look after by some older men. The gun went missing. He was then told he owed them £3,000. Clearly he couldn't find that. He was going around anybody he knew to see if they could lend him the money. And that young man is now, well, I don't know what happened to him, but that's the way that these gangs groom, one of the ways that these gangs groom young people. So those young people need support and intervention. And so one of those is around policing, and I think it's worth highlighting that in Hackney we've lost 1 in 4 police officers since 2010. And although we're linked with Tower Hamlets as one borough command unit, we've not lost any more, but there's not been any increase in the numbers of policing, so the savings there haven't materialised in additional people on the street. And neighbourhood policing, as I mentioned in my intervention to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Chingford, was a vital part of Hackney. I remember the days in Hackney where there was such distrust around the police, and neighbourhood policing helped to break down those barriers. People knew who they could talk to. They could make a call to somebody anonymously. And the number of times I've been on a doorstep on a roving surgery of people say, I want to tell you something, but don't tell the police. I don't want them to know about my address because I've got a teenage child and I'm frightened that if the police come to the door, they will be targeted. That palpable fear. So we see that fear on the one side, and on the other side, an increase in brazen behaviour, where only last June, I went to visit a community event. Had I arrived 5 minutes earlier, I would have been in the midst of teenagers who arrived on bikes, pulled out their machetes when they recognised someone else, and marauded through a group of toddlers and mostly mothers with only a couple of men in the environment. It was a small community event. Now, this didn't make the headlines. It didn't make the headlines because those were people who weren't on living their life on Twitter. They weren't living their life on social media. They were just frightened in the moment. As I arrived, someone was on the phone telling the police, for the next nearly 2 hours that I was there, not a police officer turned up. I've obviously raised this with the police, so I won't go into the detail. They said they were seeking the perpetrator. But what message does that send to our communities when we don't have enough police to go and get the evidence? They were willing to be witnesses. They could probably have between them identified the perpetrators. And those young children there, that's what they go away with, that something like that happens and the police can't even attend. And I've heard a number of tales of young people on bikes with machetes in hand, brazenly going down the street to show that they're in control because they no longer believe that the police will turn up. Now, I have to say, in defence of the police, when the police do come, I've seen some instances where they know the young people, the neighbourhood police who still are there really work hard to know the young people and try to work with them to protect them. They know what's going on. There's some really good, talented policing going on. There just aren't enough of them to do it well. And the more you remove police into police stations, into blue light cars, the more you break that connection with the community, and that is just not working. So release resources is something that the Minister really directly has to address. We can no longer, no one can ever, if they ever did pretend that it's not going to make a difference to the lives of young people on our streets and the lives of families and communities, then they are just plain wrong. And of course, this is in context, as others have said, of an £850 million round of cuts to the Metropolitan Police since 2010. And over 70% of that funding is, of course, controlled by the government. So it really is directly in the Minister's remit to tell us what she and the government are going to do. And my own committee, the Public Accounts Committee, which I have the privilege of chairing, has highlighted real concerns about one, yes, the funding for policing, but also the Home Office's understanding of exactly what the pressures are on the police, the cost shunting that goes on. The police, there is the blue light provider of first and last resort, that pick up the pieces when other public services, such as mental health and others, are under great stretch. So they're doing more, and they've got less. And this is a direct impact of that circle of austerity that is a buzzword, austerity, sometimes a positive word from the mouths of some government ministers, but actually it's having a real effect. And it needs to be explained in those terms. And of course, this is in the context as well of cuts to local authorities of around a third, and my own borough of 40% since 2010. So, Graham, I'm really weary of this. Hackney is weary. The parents in my constituency are weary. And the young people are weary and afraid. We keep raising our concerns. And I've been a member of this place for nearly 14 years and in elected office for 25 years. Children are fearful at an age when they should feel free and be able to roam their streets freely. They are afraid to go out. Their parents are worried when they are out of what's happening to them. They're worried that they won't come home. And I've met too many parents whose children didn't come home not to understand why that is. And too often I'm meeting with the parents of the families of victims who will never walk through their door again. Children nursing or burying, parents who are burying or nursing their children. I meet teachers and schools mourning a pupil. It's not a normal thing, is it, to go to a school speech day and have to talk about a child's death. And that happens just too often to us. And we're not the ones who are the victims. We're not really affected. It's those pupils and those young people who are affected. And churches who are mourning one of their own. We've all been to too many funerals. Every primary school I visit, the children raise concerns about knife crime and violence in very specific terms. And I try and reassure them that what you read in the papers, what actually happens is a small percentage of the overall, but it's still happening. And that fear escalates from the number, it gets wider and it reaches every one of them. I went to visit a youth group in Hoxton, and those young girls were telling me that just came out their biggest fear. They just all talked about the fear of knife crime. And the UK Youth Parliament's English group has made knife crime its #1 campaign priority. So we should hear, Minister, we should listen, Mr Graham, the Minister needs to listen as well, to those young people who tell us what is important to them, and it should be the most important thing to us. I want to just touch on the issues of social media, Sir Graham. My honourable friend, the member for West Ham, raised this in her speech. And I have been appalled about what I've seen, and I applaud the efforts of, among others, the honourable member for Westminster, Westminster North and Kensington, who've raised these concerns. But I was horrified to learn from a local head teacher that a close associate of a young man who is currently in prison for the brutal manslaughter of a 16-year-old girl has a following on YouTube with over 1 million followers. And these are blatant videos talking about violence and gang action on Hackney streets. And it's not bad, not just that YouTube's streaming this stuff. BBC One Extra, yeah, our own public service broadcaster a video of raps about stabbing on Hackney streets. I raised this with the BBC. In this video, they name areas, they call out rival Hackney gangs. And I was told that there's a careful analysis by the production team about the content, and they didn't think that in this case it crossed the threshold. Well, either they're living in a complete cow cuckoo land, they certainly know nothing about my borough. It was immediately obvious to me, and I'm a middle-aged woman, for goodness sake, it's not like I'm down there with the kids in that sense, but I could tell that this was not just innocent stuff. And I'm meeting the BBC next week because I was completely dissatisfied with their response. Their understanding of the reality and impact of that terminology and the references is really not good enough. And we need to work out what we're going to do about that. I know that's quite a lot for the Minister to take on, but this has to be conversations across government about what we do about that online presence. And the Mayor of London, I was really pleased, joined us in Hackney during one of our worst periods of attacks. We met with local community leaders, including some very good young youth leaders, church leaders, other key people and young people themselves to discuss what we need to do. But as I said, we know what's needed. It's not, as the Honourable Gentleman said, Right Honourable Gentleman said, it's not rocket science. In fact, it was under a Labour government, and I'm not being party political, but it was under a Labour government, that's a very long time ago now, that we began to look at some of these issues, and my honourable friend, the Right Honourable friend, the member for Gedling, was the Minister at the time, similar position to the Minister now, looking at trying to get that public health issue resolved. And as the Right Honourable Gentleman said, very difficult to get some of that health information into the mix, but very vital that we do that. That was one of the big stopping points. So it's really important that we don't just have initiative here and initiative there, but that long-term approach that so many have talked about is important. And that investment in youth work, and particularly detached youth work, is one of them. Since the Mayor of London came, one of his deputies visited, and it was really interesting to hear the young people themselves say what mattered to them and what worked for them. And that was that they could see, the older young men and women, that the diversionary opportunities for 9 and 10-year-olds, and they named that age group, was particularly important, so that they knew they had a positive future that didn't take them down the gang route, took them away from the idea that they needed to carry a knife. It still won't take away the fear, but giving them a positive outcome. And if you take, going back to the riots in Hackney in 2011, not a single Hackney school child was involved. Our schools are now among the best in the country, some of them in the top 1% in the country. I think probably enviable for the Honourable Lady in her constituency in Lincolnshire, which isn't in the same favourable position. And that they had a purpose, those young people, they didn't get involved. The Home Office has said it wants to adopt the public health approach, but we do need that investment in prevention. It's got to be much more concrete than an aspiration, and I'm hopeful that the Minister, as a thoughtful woman, will lay that out today. We know some of the triggers, as others have said. Domestic violence or some kind of traumatic incident in childhood has a big impact on the future of young people, and that can often lead in itself to exclusions from school. And if young people have a special educational need, that's often not dealt with quickly enough. These things, the fact they can't reach an educational psychologist, forces sometimes a school to exclude where we would encourage them normally to keep a child in. And delay means things escalate and can lead to that expulsion, and exclusion, which means that young people are not getting what they need. There's a whole area of work around what happens in our pupil referral units and the support that young people get there, which we haven't got time to go into today. The Serious Violence Commission is good to have, but that we want to make sure that it's actually implemented, the work that the Commission has done, and that early help and early prevention is really, really important. It's got to be more than just a pithy term. We need to invest early, make sure that those youngers in the gangs are getting supported, and that most of those youngers aren't becoming youngers, they're just staying as children with hopes and aspirations and the freedom to roam. So, Minister, I asked the Minister, Sir Graham, will she put government money behind this? It's not necessarily a lot of money, it's about how we configure the money we've got. More money is always welcome, but I'm not asking her to say, no, we can't give more money, because I know that's probably the line she's been told by her officials she has to say, because I understand she personally can't sign the cheque. I'm sure she'll be lobbying the Chancellor. The Public Accounts Committee has highlighted how the Home Office has too little understanding of the pressures on police force of the impact of funding, so I know that the Minister or her colleagues will be replying to our report on that. And what conversations is the Minister having with the Department for Education about special educational needs in particular and other support for vulnerable pupils? Everything from teaching them resilience, mental health support, and picking up, where schools so often do, that there's a problem at home that can cause problems. And not all of these young people have problems at home, but there is an overlap. And what is the Home Office doing to take account of the Serious Violent Crime Commission's recommendations? A small amount of money, for example, for an added youth work hour or two, or an extra half a youth worker, can make a huge difference. I am so impressed by the youth organisations in my constituency who I visit, who are doing amazing work, sometimes walking a young person home because they're frightened to go home alone, giving them somewhere to go. And when I've spoken to young people, very often they want something simple, somewhere warm, safe and dry to do their homework. They aren't asking for a great deal. It can make a disproportionate difference both in prevention and increasing that feeling of safety in young people so they are free to roam. I want to pay brief tribute to the hospitals in my area, the Homerton Hospital and the Royal London Hospital. Investment there in making sure that there is diversionary support. And I had recently spent some time in hospital myself and saw, in fact, not as an MP, not as a visit, but I lived there for a while, and I could see the very good impact when someone came in who was seen as a victim of a knife crime, some of the support that wrapped around in the Royal London Hospital. But it is a tragedy that both the Homerton and the Royal London Hospital are centres of excellence in this area. They shouldn't be centres of excellence in stabbing of young people. Isn't that a tragedy in itself? But they do good work and they should be commended. But it should be the case that every young person goes in with a knife, the injury is properly wrapped around and supported at that moment. And I know that my honourable friend, the member for Tooting, has really highlighted this from her very specific perspective as both an MP and an A&E doctor. And I hope that the Minister will also heed the Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford, that this needs to be an ongoing process. We have started this before. It stops, it starts again, and in the end, it's better for everybody and for the taxpayer if we do it as a long-term, ingrained approach. I hope that she's the Minister that really kicks this off. She knows she's got our strong support if she does that, but if she doesn't, we'll be snapping at her heels and making sure that we don't have to visit more families who've lost a loved one.
David Lammy.